You've been lied to. The fearless sheriff? A myth. The noble outlaw? A killer. The Wild West you grew up with.
Just a bit sooner than y'all was expecting.
The showdowns, the honor, the chaos was mostly made up. In reality, towns had gun control. Cowboys were broke laborers, and most shootouts were drunken, sloppy, and nothing like the movies. Today, we're busting the 7 biggest myths Hollywood sold you and revealing the real gritty truth of the American frontier. Number 7. Everyone carried guns and violence was everywhere. Picture a world where every man, woman, and child packed iron, where violence erupted at the slightest provocation, and where life was cheap and brutal. This image of universal armament and constant danger has become the defining characteristic of the frontier era that we've all accepted as truth. But here's the shocking reality that will blow your mind. Many frontier towns actually had stricter gun control laws than modern America, and the average person was far more likely to die from disease or accidents than from gun violence. Get ready for a truth bomb. Towns like Dodge City, Tombstone, and Deadwood had ordinances requiring visitors to check their firearms with the sheriff upon entering town. These gun-free zones were strictly enforced, and violating them could result in heavy fines or jail time. The famous signs reading, "The carrying of firearms strictly prohibited," weren't Hollywood fiction. They were real policies designed to prevent the kind of violence that would hurt business and drive away settlers. Most ordinary citizens didn't walk around armed to the teeth. Guns were tools, expensive tools that required maintenance and ammunition. A working farmer or shopkeeper was more likely to own a shotgun for hunting or pest control than a fancy revolver for gunfighting. The cost of a decent revolver could equal 2 months' wages for the average worker. Here's a fun fact that destroys another piece of the myth. The Colt 45 Peacemaker, often called the gun that won the West, wasn't even available until 1873. By that time, much of the so-called Wild West had already been settled and civilized. The entire cowboy era was largely over by the 1883s. The real killers in the Wild West weren't outlaws or gunfighters. They were cholera, typhoid, smallpox, and accidents. A person was far more likely to die from drinking contaminated water, being kicked by a horse, or falling off a roof than from a gunshot wound. Violence did occur, but it was often alcohol-fueled and spontaneous, rather than the calculated duels of legend. The myth of universal violence was largely created by Eastern newspapers that sensationalized frontier stories to entertain readers who would never venture west themselves. A mundane story about successful farming didn't sell papers, but tales of deadly shootouts certainly did. But here's the catch. While violence was less common than the myths suggest, when it did happen, it was often more brutal and senseless than Hollywood ever showed. The difference was that it usually followed legal procedures, even if those procedures were simpler than in more established areas. Wait until you discover how the entire image of the lawless frontier is largely a fabrication. This next myth will completely change your understanding. Number 6, the lawless frontier. Imagine the Wild West as a place where might made right, where there was no law beyond the gun, and where civilization was just a thin veneer over brutal chaos. This image of the lawless frontier has become so embedded in our culture that we rarely question whether it reflects reality. But here's the truth that's gonna blow your mind. The American frontier had more laws, regulations, and legal institutions than most people realize. And frontier communities often went to great lengths to establish legitimate legal systems. Most frontier towns established courts, elected officials, and created legal codes within months of their founding. These weren't lawless settlements. but communities of people trying to build stable, prosperous societies. They understood that chaos was bad for business and terrible for attracting new settlers. The famous Judge Roy Bean style of frontier justice, where a single man dispensed rough justice with little regard for legal niceties, was actually quite rare and often exaggerated in the telling. Most frontier communities understood that legitimate legal institutions were essential for attracting settlers, investment, and business development. Here's what's really shocking. Frontier territories often had more progressive laws than established eastern states. They granted women more rights, were more tolerant of different ethnic groups in some respects, and often had more democratic institutions. Wyoming Territory gave women the vote in 1869. More than 50 years before the 90th Amendment. Mining camps, often portrayed as the most lawless places on the frontier, typically established detailed legal codes within weeks of their founding. These regulations covered everything from claim disputes to sanitation requirements. The famous miners' courts weren't mob justice, but legitimate legal institutions that followed established procedures and kept detailed records. Many frontier towns had lower crime rates than contemporary eastern cities. The constant threat of economic ruin and harsh frontier conditions actually encouraged cooperation and law-abiding behavior. A reputation for dishonesty could mean financial disaster in small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. The myth of the lawless frontier was largely created by Eastern writers who had never experienced frontier life themselves. They assumed that remote areas must naturally be chaotic and violent, when the reality was that frontier communities worked harder than most places to establish order and stability. Curiously, some of the most lawless behavior actually came from established Eastern business interests trying to exploit frontier resources without regard for local laws or customs. But here's the catch. While formal legal institutions were more common than the myths suggest, frontier justice could indeed be swift and harsh when it was applied. The difference was that it usually followed legal procedures, even if those procedures were simpler and faster than in more established areas. But wait until you hear about the romantic cowboy life. This next myth is going to destroy every Western movie you've ever loved. If these hidden truths about the Wild West are surprising you, give this video a quick like. It's the easiest way to tell us you want more real history and fewer Hollywood myths. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next deep dive into the stories you thought you knew. Number 5. The romantic cowboy life. Picture the iconic cowboy, a rugged individualist riding the open range, free as the wind, living by his own code of honor. Imagine this romantic figure as the embodiment of American independence, driving cattle across vast landscapes while singing around campfires under starry skies, answering to no man but himself. But here's the brutal truth that will shatter this romantic image. Real cowboys were mostly poor, often young men doing one of the hardest, most dangerous, and least glamorous jobs in America. Get ready for a reality check that's going to destroy everything you thought you knew about cowboy life. The average cowboy was a seasonal worker who made about the same wages as a factory laborer back east, roughly $25 to $40 per month, and that was only during the few months of cattle driving season. When the drives ended, many faced unemployment and poverty. Most cowboys were teenagers or men in their early 20s because the work was so physically demanding that older men simply couldn't keep up. They worked 80-hour days in all weather, slept on the ground with minimal bedding, and ate the same monotonous meals day after day. Beans, hardtack, and coffee weren't romantic. They were survival food that barely kept malnutrition at bay. Here's what Hollywood never shows you. Cowboys spent most of their time not on dramatic cattle drives, but doing mundane ranch work, mending fences, cleaning stables, caring for sick animals, and digging irrigation ditches. The famous cattle drives that capture our imagination only lasted a few decades and employed a relatively small number of men during peak season. The end of the open range came faster than most people realize. By the 1880s, barbed wire fencing and railroad expansion had eliminated the need for long cattle drives. The entire cowboy era lasted roughly 20 years, from about 1866 to 1886. Most of the mythical cowboy period was actually over before the 19th century ended. A significant percentage of cowboys were African American or Mexican. These men have been largely written out of the popular mythology, but they made up an estimated 25% of the cowboy workforce. Many were former slaves who found more freedom and better pay on the frontier than anywhere else in post-Civil War America. The romantic image of the lone cowboy was largely created by Owen Wister's 1903 novel The Virginian and later Hollywood films. Real cowboys often worked in groups and were employees of large cattle operations, not independent operators living by their own rules. And here's the kicker: most real cowboys never owned guns. Firearms were expensive, and ranch bosses often discouraged or prohibited their workers from carrying weapons. A cowboy's tools were his rope, his horse, and his knowledge of cattle behavior, not his shooting iron. The reality was that cowboys were agricultural workers, not the romantic wanderers of legend. They were more likely to die from pneumonia or a horse accident than in a gunfight. But wait until you discover the truth about the frontier women. This next myth will completely change how you see the Wild West. Number 4. The helpless pioneer. Women and tragic saloon girls. Picture this: a beautiful saloon girl with a heart of gold, serving drinks and entertaining rough cowboys while secretly yearning for a better life. Or imagine the helpless pioneer woman, dependent on men for protection and rarely venturing beyond her cabin. These stereotypes have dominated our understanding of women in the Wild West for generations. But the shocking reality is that frontier women were often more independent, powerful, and diverse than any Hollywood film has ever dared to show. Let's start with the myth of the soiled dove, the term used for women who worked in saloons and brothels. While prostitution certainly existed on the frontier, the popular image of the tragic fallen woman doesn't match the historical reality for many of these women. Some of the most successful entrepreneurs in frontier towns were women who ran boarding houses, restaurants, and yes, even brothels. These women owned property, made business decisions, and wielded considerable economic influence. In a cash-poor economy, they often had more liquid assets than their male counterparts. Take Belle Brezing, who became one of the wealthiest people in Lexington, Kentucky, through her business acumen, or Martha Bullock, who wasn't content to stay in the background while her husband served as sheriff. She became a prominent community leader and successful businesswoman. Here's what's really fascinating. Western territories often granted women rights that were unthinkable in eastern states. Wyoming Territory gave women the vote in 1869, more than 50 years before the 19th Amendment. Utah Territory followed in 1870. These weren't accidents, but deliberate policies designed to attract settlers and establish stable communities. The frontier created opportunities for women that simply didn't exist in more civilized society. Women homesteaded land, ran businesses, and took on roles that would have scandalized Eastern society. Some disguised themselves as men to gain even more opportunities, like Charlie Parkhurst, who spent decades as a successful stagecoach driver before being discovered to be a woman only after death. Many of the famous dance hall girls portrayed in westerns were actually skilled performers who commanded high wages and respect. They weren't fallen women, but professional entertainers who traveled from town to town, often making more money than the local sheriff. They had agents, contracts, and professional reputations to maintain. The myth of the helpless pioneer woman ignores the incredible strength and resilience required to survive on the frontier. These women delivered babies without doctors, defended their homes when men were away, managed complex household economies, and often made the difference between a family's survival and starvation. But here's the catch. While the frontier offered unprecedented opportunities for some women, it was still an incredibly difficult and dangerous life. Disease, isolation, and the constant threat of financial ruin made frontier life challenging for everyone, regardless of gender. The stereotype of the dependent frontier woman was largely created by Eastern writers who couldn't imagine women functioning independently in harsh conditions. And if you think the myths about women are surprising, wait until you hear the truth about the famous outlaws. This next revelation will shock you. Number 3. The noble outlaw, fighting injustice. Imagine a dashing outlaw, robbing trains and banks, but only taking from the rich and corrupt, always sparing innocent passengers and fighting against an unjust system. This romantic image of the noble bandit has captured imaginations for generations, with figures like Jesse James and Billy the Kid becoming folk heroes in American culture. But the shocking reality is that most outlaws were brutal criminals who showed little concern for innocent victims, and their causes were often invented by sympathetic writers years after their deaths. Take Jesse James, probably the most famous outlaw in American history. The popular myth portrays him as a Confederate patriot fighting against Northern oppression after the Civil War, a Robin Hood figure stealing from corrupt banks and railroads. In reality, James was a violent criminal who robbed banks and trains for personal gain, showing no mercy to innocent victims. His gang killed numerous innocent people, including bank clerks who were just doing their jobs, train engineers who posed no threat, and bystanders who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The James Gang's first documented bank robbery was in Liberty, Missouri, where they shot and killed an innocent college student who happened to be walking nearby. This wasn't justice, it was senseless violence that terrorized entire communities. The famous Robin Hood narrative around Jesse James wasn't created during his lifetime. It was largely invented by newspaper editor John Newman Edwards, who wrote romanticized accounts of the gang's exploits to sell papers and promote his political agenda. Edwards transformed a brutal criminal into a folk hero for his own purposes. Billy the Kid presents another example of myth-making gone wild. He's been portrayed as everything from a misunderstood youth fighting corrupt cattle barons to a cold-blooded killer. The truth is that Henry McCarty was a small-time rustler and hired gun who got caught up in a business dispute known as the Lincoln County War. The real Billy the Kid wasn't fighting for justice. He was fighting for one faction of businessmen against another. Both sides were equally corrupt, and Billy switched sides when it benefited him financially. He was a mercenary, not a crusader for justice. Here's what's really disturbing about the noble outlaw myth. It often ignores the real victims of these crimes. Bank robberies didn't just hurt wealthy bankers, they threatened the life savings of ordinary farmers, shopkeepers, and working families who trusted their local banks with their hard-earned money. Train robberies disrupted mail service, delayed important supplies to frontier communities, and made travel dangerous for ordinary citizens trying to build new lives in the West. The romanticization of outlaws was largely a product of dime novels and later Hollywood films that needed clear heroes and villains. The complex reality of frontier crime didn't fit neatly into simple stories of good versus evil. But here's the catch. While most outlaws were simply criminals, the corrupt systems they sometimes fought against were real. The tragedy is that their criminal methods often made legitimate reform more difficult. Wait until you discover the truth about the fearless sheriffs who supposedly cleaned up these towns. This next myth will blow your mind. Number 2. The fearless sheriff who single-handedly cleaned up the town. Every great Western has that moment. A new sheriff rides into a lawless town, pins on his badge, and single-handedly brings order to chaos through sheer courage and gunfighting skill. Think Wyatt Earp cleaning up Dodge City, or the countless fictional lawmen who tamed wild frontier settlements with nothing but iron will and a fast draw. Here's the brutal truth that's going to shatter this heroic image. Most frontier towns weren't nearly as violent as the myths suggest, and when they were, it usually wasn't one heroic sheriff who cleaned them up. The famous cattle towns like Dodge City and Abilene had murder rates that were actually lower than many modern American cities. In Dodge City's peak years, the annual murder rate averaged about 1.5 deaths per year in a population of roughly 1,000 people. Compare that to modern crime statistics, and you'll find that many contemporary cities are far more dangerous than the wild frontier ever was. But here's what's really fascinating. When towns did need cleaning up, it was typically accomplished through economic pressure and community organization, not gun-slinging lawmen. Business owners wanted stable, safe environments for commerce. They hired peace officers, established courts, and created ordinances that made violence unprofitable and bad for business. Curiously, many famous lawmen were more concerned with protecting gambling halls and saloons than with bringing moral order to their communities. These establishments paid licensing fees and taxes that funded the town's growth. A good sheriff often meant someone who could keep the peace while allowing profitable vice to continue operating smoothly. The myth of the lone, heroic sheriff was largely created by writers who needed simple, dramatic narratives. The reality was far more complex, involving politics, economics, and community cooperation. Rather than individual heroism, town taming was a collective effort, not a one-man crusade. And here's the kicker. Many famous lawmen of the Wild West had criminal backgrounds themselves. They understood both sides of the law because they'd lived on both sides. Wyatt Earp had been arrested for horse theft. Bat Masterson had a gambling problem, and Wild Bill Hickok killed more men as a gunfighter than as a lawman. Most peace officers were appointed not for their moral character, but for their ability to maintain order and collect taxes. They were civil servants, not crusading heroes. Their job was to keep the peace profitable, not to impose moral standards on frontier communities. Many sheriffs were part-time officials who also ran businesses or worked other jobs. Law enforcement was often a secondary source of income, rather than a calling or crusade. The romanticized image of the fearless lawman was created decades after the frontier period ended, when writers and filmmakers needed heroic figures to anchor their stories. But here's the catch. While individual sheriffs rarely cleaned up entire towns single-handedly, the institution of professional law enforcement was crucial to frontier development. The myth gets the process wrong, but the importance of legitimate authority was real. But wait until you hear about the most famous shootout in history. This final myth is going to completely destroy everything you thought you knew. I'd love to hear your take. Which Wild West myth do you think is the hardest to let go of? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read them all, and we might even feature your comment in a future video. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and join our community of history detectives. Number 1. The High Noon Shootout. Picture the most iconic image of the Wild West. Two gunslingers facing each other in the middle of a dusty street, hands twitching above their holsters, waiting for the church bell to strike noon. This dramatic scene has been burned into our collective memory through countless movies and novels as the ultimate test of courage and skill. But here's the shocking reality that will destroy this romantic image. Documented high noon duels were extremely rare, and most gunfights looked nothing like what you've seen on screen. Real gunfights in the Wild West were usually messy, chaotic affairs that happened at close range, often in saloons or gambling halls, with little warning and no ceremony. The famous quick draw wasn't about speed. It was about accuracy and survival under pressure. Most gunfighters didn't even wear their guns in fast-draw holsters designed for dramatic face-offs. They carried their weapons in coat pockets, waistbands, or in holsters designed for comfort during long rides. Not rapid deployment. The elaborate gun belts and tied-down holsters of Western films were largely Hollywood inventions designed to look dramatic on screen. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral, often cited as the ultimate Western showdown, lasted only about 30 seconds and took place at close range, roughly 6 feet between the opposing sides. No dramatic walking toward each other, no tense stare-downs, just a brutal and quick exchange of gunfire in a narrow lot between the buildings. The myth of the high noon duel was largely created by dime novels and later Hollywood films. Writers needed dramatic tension, and what's more dramatic than two men facing death in broad daylight with the entire town watching? The reality was far less cinematic, but much more deadly. Most real gun fights happened suddenly, often over gambling disputes, personal insults, or business disagreements. They were typically fought with whatever weapons were handy: knives, clubs, bottles, or guns, and usually involved alcohol and bad decision-making rather than honor and skill. And if I told you that most gunfighters were more likely to shoot someone in the back than face them head-on, the reality is that survival mattered more than honor, and ambushes were far more common than fair fights. Professional killers understood that the goal was to win, not to look heroic. The elaborate codes of honor portrayed in Westerns were largely fictional. Real frontier violence was brutal, quick, and often cowardly by the standards of Hollywood heroism. Here's what's really disturbing. The high noon duel myth has become so powerful that it's influenced real behavior. Some modern gunfighters have actually tried to recreate these fictional scenarios, not understanding that they were never based on historical reality. The truth is that frontier violence was more like modern gang warfare than the honorable duels of legend. Sudden, brutal, and usually involving people who knew each other personally. But here's the catch. While the dramatic face-off was largely fictional, the underlying tensions that led to real frontier violence were very real. Personal honor, economic competition, and social conflict did lead to deadly confrontations, just not in the stylized manner we've been taught to expect. The real tragedy isn't just that the myth is false, but that it's overshadowed the more complex and interesting reality of how conflicts were actually resolved on the frontier. Understanding the real history doesn't diminish the frontier experience. It makes it more remarkable. The people who settled the American West accomplished something genuinely impressive. They built a society from scratch in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. And they did it through cooperation, hard work, and legal institutions, not gunfights and vigilante justice. Which of these myth-busting revelations surprised you the most? Did any of them completely change how you think about the Wild West? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing how these historical truths affect people's understanding of this fascinating period. And if you enjoyed this journey into the real Wild West, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We've got plenty more myth-busting adventures planned, and you won't want to miss our next deep dive into the hidden truths behind America's most cherished legends. Thanks for joining us on this countdown of deception.